This is a reading from the book entitled Purgatory, explained by the Lives and Legends of the Saints by Father F.X. Shoup, S.J. Chapter 47, Advantages, Temporal Favors, L'Abbé Postel, and the Servant of Paris. The following is related as a fact by the Abbé Postel, the translator of Father Rossignoli's work. It took place in Paris, he says, about the year 1827, and is inserted as number 27 in the Merveilles du Purgatoire. A poor servant who had been brought up as a good Christian in her native village had adopted the pious practice of having a Mass said every month for the suffering souls. Her employers having taken her with them to the capital, she never once neglected it, and furthermore made it her rule to assist at the divine sacrifice and to unite her prayers with those of the priest, especially for the soul that had most nearly completed its expiation. This was her ordinary intention. God soon tried her by a long illness that not only occasioned her cruel suffering, but also caused her to lose her place and draw upon her last resources. On the day that she was able to leave the hospital, she had but 20 sous left. After addressing a fervent prayer to heaven, full of confidence, she went in search of a situation. She was told that she would probably find employment in a certain family at the other end of the city, whither she went, and as she was obliged to pass by the church of Saint Eustache, she entered. The sight of a priest at the altar reminded her that this month she had forgotten her usual Mass for the dead, and that this was the very day upon which for many years she had been accustomed to do this good work. But what was she to do? If she disposed of her last franc, she would have nothing left, even to satisfy her hunger. It was a struggle between devotion and human prudence. Devotion gained the day. After all, she said to herself, the good God knows it is for him, and he will not forsake me. Entering the sacristy, she gave her offering for a Mass, at which she assisted with her usual fervor. A few moments after, she continued on her way, full of anxiety, as may be readily understood. Being absolutely destitute of means, what was she to do if she failed to obtain employment? She was still occupied with these thoughts when a pale young man of a slight figure and distinguished appearance approached her and said, "Are you in search of a situation?" "Yes, sir." "Well, go to a certain street and number to the house of Madame blank. I think you will suit her, and that you will be satisfied there." Having spoken these words, he disappeared in the passing crowd, without waiting to receive the poor girl's thanks. She found the street, recognized the number, and ascended to the apartments. A servant came out carrying a package under her arm and uttering words of complaint and anger. "Is Madame there?" asked the newcomer. "She may or may not be," replied the other. "What does it matter to me? Madame will open the door herself if it suits her. I will trouble myself no longer about it. Adieu." And she descended the steps. Our poor girl rang the bell with trembling hand, and a sweet voice bade her enter. She found herself in the presence of an old lady of venerable appearance, who encouraged her to make known her wishes. "Madame," said the servant, "I learned this morning that you were in need of a servant, and I came to offer my services. I was assured that you would receive me kindly." "Oh, but my dear child, what you tell me is very extraordinary. This morning I had no need of one. It is only within the last half hour that I have discharged an insolent domestic, and there is not a soul in the world except her and myself who know it." "Who sent you, then?" "It was a gentleman, madam, a young gentleman, whom I met on the street, who stopped me for this purpose, and I praised God for it is absolutely necessary for me to find a place today. I have not a penny in my pocket." The old lady could not understand who the person was, and was lost in conjecture, when the servant, raising her eyes to the furniture of the little parlour, perceived a portrait. "Wait, madam," she said immediately. "Do not puzzle yourself any more. This is the exact picture of the young man who spoke to me. It is on his account that I am come." At these words the lady uttered a loud cry, and seemed to lose consciousness. She made the girl repeat the story of her devotion to the souls in purgatory, of the morning Mass, and her meeting with the stranger. Then, throwing herself on the neck of the girl, she embraced her amid a flood of tears, and said, "You shall not be my servant from this moment. You are my daughter. It is my son, my only son, whom you saw. My son, dead for the past 2 years, who owes to you this his deliverance, whom God directed to send you here. I cannot doubt it. May you then be blessed, and let us pray continually for all those who suffer before entering into a blessed eternity. Chapter 48. Advantages, temporal favors, the Neapolitan woman, and the mysterious note. To prove that the souls in purgatory show their gratitude even by temporal favors, Father Rossignoli relates a fact that happened at Naples which bears some resemblance to that which we have just read. It is not given to all to offer to God the abundant alms of Judas Maccabeus, who sent 12,000 drachmas to Jerusalem for the sacrifices and prayers to be offered in behalf of the dead. There are very few who cannot at least make the offering of the poor widow of the gospel, who was praised by our Saviour himself. She gave only 2 mites, but said, Jesus, these 2 mites were of more value than all the gold of the rich. Because of her want, cast in all she had, even her whole living. Footnote 1, St. Mark, chapter 12, verse 44. This touching example was imitated by a humble Neapolitan woman, who had the greatest difficulty in providing for the wants of her family. The resources of the house depended upon the daily earnings of the husband, who each evening brought home the fruit of his labors. Alas, one day this poor father was imprisoned for debt, so that the responsibility of supporting the family rested upon the unhappy mother, who possessed nothing but her confidence in God. With faith, she besought divine providence to come to her aid, and especially to deliver her husband, who languished in prison for no other crime than his poverty. She went to a wealthy and benevolent gentleman, and relating to him the sad story of her woes, entreated him with tears to assist her. God permitted that she would receive but a trifling alms, a carlin, a piece of money worth about 10 cents of our coin. Deeply afflicted, she entered a church to implore the God of the indigent to succor her in her distress, since she had nothing to hope from earth. She was absorbed in her prayers and tears when, by an inspiration, no doubt of her good angel, it occurred to her to interest the sympathy of the holy souls in her behalf, for she had heard much of their sufferings and of their gratitude towards those who befriend them. Full of confidence, she went into the sacristy, offered her little piece of money, and asked if a mass could be celebrated for the dead. The good priest who was there hastened to say mass for her intention, and ascended the altar for that purpose, whilst the poor woman, prostrate on the pavement, assisted at the holy sacrifice, offering her prayers for the departed. She returned quite consoled, as though she had received the assurance that God had heard her prayer. Whilst traversing the populous streets of Naples, she was accosted by a venerable old man, who inquired whence she came and whither she was going. The unfortunate woman explained her distress, the use she had made of the small alms she had received. The old man seemed deeply touched by her misery, spoke some words of encouragement, and gave her a note enclosed in an envelope, which he directed her to take to a gentleman whom he designated, and then left her. The woman went in all haste to deliver the note to the gentleman indicated. The latter, on opening the envelope, was seized with astonishment, and was on the point of fainting away. He recognized the handwriting of his father, who had died some time previous. "Where did you get this letter?" he cried, quite beside himself. "Sir," replied the good woman, "it was from an old man who accosted me in the street. I told him of my distress, and he sent me to give you this note in his name. As regards his features, he very much resembles that portrait which you have there over the door." More and more impressed by these circumstances, the gentleman again took up the note and read aloud, "My son, your father has just been delivered from purgatory, thanks to a mass which the bearer has had celebrated this morning. She is in great distress, and I recommend her to you." He read and reread those lines, traced by that hand so dear to him, by a father who was now among the number of the elect. Tears of joy coursed down his cheeks as he turned towards the woman. "Poor woman," he said, "by your trifling alms you have secured the eternal felicity of him who gave me life. In my turn I will secure your temporal happiness. I take upon myself to supply all the needs of yourself and your whole family." What joy for that gentleman! What joy for that poor woman! It is difficult to say on which side was the greatest happiness. What is the most important and most easy is to see the instruction to be derived from this incident. It teaches us that the smallest act of charity towards the members of the church suffering is precious in the sight of God and draws down upon us miracles of mercy. Chapter 49. Advantages, spiritual and temporal favors. Christopher Sandoval at Louvain, the lawyer renouncing the world. Brother Lacci and Dr. Verdiano. Let us here cite another example, the more worthy of mention, as the great Pope, Clement VIII, saw therein the finger of God and recommended its publication for the edification of the Church. Several authors, says Father Rossignoli, have related the marvelous assistance which Christopher Sandoval, Archbishop of Seville, received from the souls in purgatory. Whilst still a child, he was accustomed to distribute part of his pocket money in alms for the benefit of the holy souls. His piety increased with his age. For the sake of the poor suffering souls, he gave away all that he could dispose of, and even went so far as to deprive himself of 1,000 little things which were useful or necessary. When he was pursuing his studies at the University of Louvain, it happened that some letters which he expected from Spain were delayed, in consequence of which he found himself reduced to such pecuniary straits that he had scarcely wherewith to purchase food. At this moment a poor person asked of him an alms for love of the souls in purgatory, and what had never happened to him before, he was obliged to refuse. Afflicted by this circumstance, he went into a church. If, said he, I cannot give an alms for my poor souls, I can at least give them the assistance of my prayers. Scarcely had he finished his prayer when, on leaving the church, he was accosted by a beautiful young man dressed as a traveler, who saluted him with respectful affability. Christopher experienced a feeling of religious awe, as though he were in the presence of a spirit in human form. But he was soon reassured by his amiable interlocutor, who spoke to him with the greatest gentleness of the Marquis of Dania, his father, his relatives, and friends, just as a Spaniard who had recently arrived from the peninsula. He ended by begging him to accompany him to a hotel, where they could dine together and be more at their ease. Sandoval, who had not eaten anything since the previous day, gladly accepted the gracious offer. They therefore seated themselves at table and continued to converse most pleasantly together. After the repast, the stranger gave Sandoval a sum of money, entreating him to accept it, and to make use of it for any purpose he pleased, adding that the Marquis, his father, would make him compensation on his return to Spain. Then, under pretext of transacting some business, he withdrew, and Christopher never saw him again. Notwithstanding all his inquiries concerning the stranger, he never succeeded in obtaining any information regarding him. No one, neither in Louvain nor Spain, had ever seen or known a young man corresponding to his description. As regards the sum of money, it was exactly the amount which the pious Christopher needed to defray expenses until the arrival of his letters, and this money was never afterwards claimed from his family. He was therefore convinced that heaven had worked a miracle in his favor, and had sent to his assistance one of those souls that he himself had relieved by his prayers and alms. He was confirmed in this opinion by Pope Clement VIII, to whom he related the incident when he went to Rome to receive the bulls raising him to the episcopate. This pontiff, struck by the extraordinary circumstances of the case, advised him to make it known for the edification of the faithful. He looked upon it as a favor from heaven, which proved how precious in the sight of God is charity towards the departed. Such is the gratitude of the holy souls which have left this world, that they testify it even for favors bestowed upon them whilst they were still in this life. It is related in the annals of the friar preachers, Footnote 1, Malvenda, Anne, 1241, that among those who went to receive the habit from the hands of St. Dominic in 1241, there was a lawyer who had quitted his profession under extraordinary circumstances. He was united by ties of friendship to a young man of great piety, whom he had charitably assisted during the sickness of which he died. This was sufficient to move the deceased to procure for him the greatest of all benefits, that of conversion and vocation to a religious life. About 30 days after his death he appeared to the lawyer and implored his assistance, because he was in purgatory. Are your sufferings intense?" he asked of his friend. "Alas," replied the latter, "if the whole earth with its forests and mountains were on fire, it would not form a furnace such as the one in which I am plunged." Seized with fear, his faith revived, and thinking only of his own soul, he asked, "In what state am I in the eyes of God?" "In a bad state," replied the deceased, "and in a dangerous profession." "What have I to do? What advice do you give me?" "Quit the perverse world in which you are engaged, and occupy yourself only with the affairs of your soul." The lawyer, following this counsel, gave all his goods to the poor, and took the habit of St. Dominic. Let us see how a holy religious of the Society of Jesus showed his gratitude, even after death, to the physician who had attended him during his last illness. Francis Lacci, a brother coadjutor, died in the College of Naples in 1598. He was a man of God, full of charity, patience, and tender devotion towards the Blessed Virgin. Some time after his death, Dr. Verdiano entered the church of the college to assist at Mass before beginning his visits. It was the day on which were celebrated the obsequies of King Philip II, who had died 4 months previous. When, on leaving the church, he was about to take holy water, a religious approached and asked him why the catafalque had been prepared, and whose was the service about to be celebrated. "It is that of King Philip II," he replied. At the same time, Verdiano, astonished that a religious should ask such a question of a stranger, and not distinguishing the features of his interlocutor, in the obscurity of the place where he stood, asked who he was. "I am," he answered, "Brother Lacci, whom you attended during my last illness." The doctor looked at him attentively, and recognized perfectly the features of Lacci. Stupefied with astonishment, he said, "But you died of that disease. Are you then suffering in purgatory? And do you come to ask our suffrages? Blessed be God, I am no longer in pain nor sorrow. I need not your suffrages. I am in the joy of paradise." "And King Philip, is he also already in paradise?" "Yes, he is there, but placed as much below me as he was elevated above me upon earth. As for you, Dr. Verdiano, where do you propose to make your first visit today?" Verdiano having replied that he was then going to the patrician Di Maio, who was dangerously ill, Lacci warned him to guard against the great danger which menaced him at the door of the house. In fact, the doctor found there a large stone so placed that on being shaken it would have fallen and mortally injured him. This material circumstance seemed to have been designed by Providence to prove to Verdiano that he had not been the sport of an illusion.